A lonely park ranger, while inspecting the forest after a storm, noticed a strange door on a massive sequoia, barely visible among the bark. Curiosity made him come closer and open it. What he saw inside the ancient tree changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The forest groaned under the weight of the storm. The sound was not merely wind, but something older, deeper, as if the ancient redwoods themselves were sighing in their sleep. Rain hammered against the canopies, rolling down the colossal trunks in silver threads, and thunder grumbled above like an angry god. The air was thick with the scent of pine resin and wet soil, and the world had turned gray, blurring the line between sky and earth. Marcus Pierce tightened the hood of his rain jacket and pushed forward through the mud, each step sinking slightly before releasing with a wet gasp. He had been a ranger for 7 years, but nothing in his previous assignments had prepared him for the wilderness of Northern California. The trees here were older than any city, older than any nation. Some had been alive when Rome still ruled the world, and now they stood silent, stoic, indifferent to the small man pushing through their shadows. He paused for a moment to wipe the water from his face. His radio crackled, spitting static, and then a voice came faintly through the noise. His supervisor from headquarters, distant and distorted. "Pierce, you there? You're heading toward the North Rim, correct?" Marcus pressed the transmitter button, but the rain muffled his words. "Copy. I'm on the trail, just past marker 9, heading for the old sector to assess storm damage." The reply came in fragments. "Be careful out there. That area hasn't been checked in years. Some of those paths were abandoned before the last restoration. Watch your footing." Marcus smiled faintly, though no one could see it. "Copy that. I'll be fine," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. The path wound upward, then disappeared under a tangle of fallen branches. He climbed over them, breathing heavily, his boots slipping against the mossy bark. The storm was finally easing, but in its wake it left a dense fog that crawled between the trunks like smoke. Every sound seemed magnified, the snap of a twig, the rush of water, the echo of his own breath. For a moment, he imagined he wasn't alone, that something ancient and unseen was moving alongside him in the mist. He stopped, gripping the strap of his pack. The silence was complete now, and yet the forest didn't feel empty. It felt aware. He shook his head, forcing the thought away. "You're just tired," he muttered under his breath. "Too many hours in the rain." He checked his compass, then continued north. His mission was simple: survey the storm's aftermath, record fallen trees, check for landslides, and report any signs of human interference. But there was a quiet anxiety that had followed him since morning, a feeling that today would not be like other patrols. The storm had torn open something, not just in the landscape, but in him. As he walked, his mind drifted back to his father. The old man had been a ranger too, though stricter, more traditional. He had believed in duty, in following orders, and never letting emotion cloud judgment. Marcus used to think of him as invincible, a man carved from the same granite as the mountains he protected. But when he died suddenly 2 years earlier, Marcus realized how fragile even the strongest men could be. His father had left him his uniform, his compass, and a short note that said only, "Keep walking. The forest will teach you the rest." Marcus had carried that compass ever since, though he wasn't sure he'd learned anything the forest wanted to teach. He'd tried to make sense of life after his divorce, after losing the rhythm of family, after moving from state to state in search of something that felt like purpose. This new post in Oregon or what the maps called Oregon's Edge, though it was nearly California, had been his attempt to start over. A new park, new people, new silence. He reached a clearing where a stream had overflown its banks, cutting across the trail. The water glimmered in the fading daylight, thick with mud. He crouched, dipping his fingers into it. It was icy cold. Around him, the forest floor was littered with broken branches and the scattered remains of a bird's nest. The storm had been brutal, but through the destruction, he felt an odd peace. The forest always rebuilt itself, no matter how fierce the winds. He walked until the light began to fade. Dusk arrived early under the dense canopy. The temperature dropped, and mist began to coil around the bases of the trees. His radio gave one last burst of static before falling silent. No signal. He was truly alone now. Marcus knew the rules. Never travel too far off the marked paths. Never lose sight of your bearings before dark. But something tugged at him. A faint glow deeper in the forest. It was small, uncertain, like the reflection of a lantern through the fog. He frowned. There shouldn't be anyone here. This area was off limits to campers and loggers alike. Maybe a stranded hiker, he thought, or an illegal fire. He hesitated, remembering the last time curiosity had cost him a night of trouble, but duty overruled hesitation. He adjusted his flashlight, took a slow breath, and stepped off the trail. The forest thickened as he moved forward. Massive roots rose like the backs of sleeping animals. The ground felt soft, almost spongy beneath his boots. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their trunks forming a silent wall that guided him toward the faint light ahead. It flickered once, as though aware of his approach. Marcus stopped again. The glow was coming from the base of a colossal redwood, so tall it vanished into the mist above. Its bark was dark and ancient, its girth so massive that a dozen men could not have circled it with their arms. For a moment, he simply stared, overwhelmed by the presence of it. He had seen old trees before, but this one felt alive in a way that defied reason, as if the centuries themselves had gathered inside its heart. He stepped closer. The light was faint but steady, leaking through a thin vertical line along the trunk no wider than a hand. He crouched to examine it and felt a sudden wave of warmth. Impossible. The rain had chilled the air to near freezing, yet the surface of the bark was warm to the touch. He pressed his palm against it, and the faint vibration beneath his hand startled him. It was like the quiet hum of machinery or the pulse of something breathing deep within. "Is someone there?" he called softly, half expecting no answer. The forest gave him none. Only the wind responded, sighing through the branches high above. He swallowed and leaned closer. The seam in the bark was too straight, too perfect to be natural. His eyes followed it upward. It extended nearly 2 meters, forming what looked unmistakably like a door. His heartbeat quickened. Who could have built this? How long ago? The light was not firelight. It was steady, golden, almost electrical. He tried the surface again. To his astonishment, a section of bark shifted slightly under pressure, creaking like an old hinge. He froze. His breath caught between fear and wonder. Every instinct told him to back away, to return to the safety of the trail. But another part of him, a quiet, persistent voice deep inside, whispered that he had been brought here for a reason. Slowly, he pushed. The door moved inward with a soft groan, releasing a wave of warm air scented with cedar and smoke. He blinked as his eyes adjusted to the dim light spilling from within. The space beyond was narrow, but unmistakably man-made. Wooden steps descended into a hollow chamber, illuminated by oil lamps mounted along the inner walls. Marcus hesitated on the threshold. This was no ordinary hiding place. The craftsmanship was intricate, the walls smoothed and reinforced. There was no sign of decay. Whoever had built it knew exactly what they were doing. He took one step inside, then another. The sound of his boots echoed faintly, swallowed quickly by the still air. The storm outside seemed distant now, like a memory. Inside the tree, it was warm, silent, alive. At the far end of the chamber, he saw a table carved from a single slab of redwood, polished smooth. A kettle rested over a small wood stove that burned with quiet steadiness. A line of books sat neatly on a shelf, titles worn, their spines faded. And near the wall hung an old military jacket, olive drab with a patch that read U.S. Army. For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. The world outside might as well have disappeared. It was as if he had stepped not into a hiding place, but into a memory, someone's secret life carved into the heart of a living tree. He exhaled slowly, barely aware that he was trembling. He wasn't supposed to be here. Yet something about this hidden sanctuary felt profoundly right, as though the forest had chosen him to see it. He reached towards the jacket, intending only to confirm it was real, when a faint sound stopped him, a quiet cough from the shadows beyond the lamplight. Marcus froze. The sound came again, followed by the scrape of a chair leg. A figure moved in the dimness at the far end of the hollow. The man who emerged was tall, though slightly stooped, with a thick beard and weathered skin. His eyes were sharp even in the half-light, and though his face was lined with age, there was strength in the way he carried himself. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the low hum of the stove filled the air. Then the man said quietly, his voice deep and even, "You shouldn't be here, son." Marcus's throat tightened. "I didn't mean to intrude. I saw the light and thought someone might need help." The old man regarded him silently. Rain dripped faintly through the cracks above, a rhythm like slow breathing. Finally, the man nodded toward the stove. "Storm's still out there. No sense freezing to death. Close the door behind you." Marcus hesitated, then obeyed. The heavy bark swung shut, sealing them inside. The light grew softer, the air thicker with the scent of wood smoke. He turned back toward the man, uncertain what to say next. He felt like a trespasser in a church built by hand. The man's eyes softened slightly as he gestured to a stool near the table. "Sit," he said simply. "You look like you've walked through half the world." Marcus sat down slowly, heart pounding, realizing that his journey through the storm had led him somewhere he could never have imagined, a place that shouldn't exist, inside a living tree, inhabited by a man who seemed as much a part of the forest as the roots beneath them. Outside, the wind howled again, but inside the redwood there was only the faint ticking of a clock, the steady crackle of the stove, and the feeling that something extraordinary had just begun. The warmth inside the redwood felt unreal, as if Marcus had crossed into another world, one immune to the storm's fury outside. The door, when it closed behind him, sealed the forest away like a dream fading into silence. The scent of wood smoke, oil, and something faintly sweet hung in the air. The flickering lamplight painted the walls with amber hues, revealing the careful craftsmanship that had turned the hollow of this ancient tree into a living home. The old man who had spoken stood quietly by the stove, stirring a small pot on the iron surface. He moved slowly but deliberately, every gesture measured and calm. Marcus watched, unsure what to say, still overwhelmed by the impossibility of what surrounded him. He had stepped into what should have been a hollow trunk, but the interior was larger than logic allowed, shaped with precision and care. The walls curved smoothly, polished by hand, and shelves had been carved directly from the wood itself, filled with books, jars, and small wooden sculptures. "Drink?" the man asked, breaking the silence at last. His voice was rough, but not unfriendly. He poured steaming liquid into a tin mug and set it before Marcus. Herbal. Nothing fancy. Marcus accepted it, nodding his thanks. The warmth of the mug seeped into his fingers, grounding him in the present moment. The liquid smelled of pine needles and mint. He took a cautious sip, then looked up at his host. "You live here?" The man smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You could say that." For a while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the quiet ticking of a small wooden clock and the wind's distant sighs through the outer bark. Marcus glanced around again, still unable to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be possible. There was a small table built from a single slab of polished redwood, a bed of woven blankets tucked neatly against one wall, and a makeshift workbench cluttered with tools and half-finished carvings. A lantern hung from a hook overhead, its glass blackened with years of use. "How long?" Marcus finally asked. "How long have you been here?" The old man turned toward him, his face catching the glow of the lamp. "Long enough," he said simply, "long enough to call it home." He saw Marcus's puzzled expression and added after a pause, "Close to 30 years, I reckon, give or take a few seasons." Marcus nearly dropped his mug. 30 years? Inside this tree? The man chuckled softly. "Not inside the tree, son, with it." He reached out and tapped the wall beside him, as though greeting an old friend. "This tree was here long before me, and will be here long after. I just learned how to listen to it." Marcus found himself staring at him, searching for signs of madness and finding none. The man's eyes were clear, intelligent, calm. This was not some deranged hermit, but someone who had chosen solitude deliberately, almost reverently. "I'm Marcus," he said at last, realizing he hadn't introduced himself. "Park Ranger." "Leroy," the man replied, nodding slightly. "Leroy Hutchins." The name stirred something faint in Marcus's memory. Perhaps an old report, a missing veteran, a story half heard in ranger training about a man who'd vanished after the war. But he pushed the thought aside. "I didn't think anyone lived out here," he said quietly. "This section hasn't been patrolled in years." "That's the point," Leroy said. "No one comes here. The forest can breathe." Marcus took another sip of the drink, feeling both uneasy and fascinated. Everything about this place defied reason, yet it felt peaceful, sacred even. "You built all this yourself?" Leroy nodded. "Every inch. Took me most of my first decade here just to make it safe. You'd be surprised what a man can do when he's got no one but himself to argue with." He walked to a narrow door at the back of the room and opened it. Behind it was a descending staircase carved directly into the wood. Light flickered faintly from below. "Come on," Leroy said. "Might as well see the rest of it." Marcus hesitated, but curiosity overpowered caution. He followed the old man down the steps, his boots echoing softly on the smoothed wood. The air grew cooler as they descended, and then opened into a wide underground chamber. Marcus stopped on the last step, unable to speak. It was like stepping into a hidden world, a vast circular room carved beneath the forest floor. The walls glowed faintly with reflected lamplight, revealing a living space that could have been mistaken for a craftsman's dream. There was running water, trickling gently from a pipe into a stone basin. Solar-powered lights hung from the ceiling, their glow faint but steady. A table sat at the center, surrounded by hand-carved chairs. The floor was smooth, polished until it shone like amber. Leroy watched Marcus's face, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You're thinking how it's possible, aren't you?" Marcus nodded slowly. "It's incredible. How did you do all this alone?" The old man's smile was tinged with melancholy. "Time and quiet, son. That's all I ever had. I learned to build what I needed and forget what I didn't." He ran his hand across the surface of the table. "Most people don't realize how much they can do when no one's watching over their shoulder." Marcus walked deeper into the room, his flashlight beam gliding across the shelves filled with tools and old mechanical parts. There were jars of preserved fruit, bundles of dried herbs, and notebooks stacked neatly in a corner. Everything here spoke of years, decades of patient labor. "Why?" Marcus asked softly. "Why stay hidden like this?" Leroy's gaze followed the trickle of water into the basin. "Because the world out there forgot how to be quiet," he said. "After the war, I couldn't hear myself think. I'd wake up every night to sirens, to shouting, to things that weren't there anymore. People said I needed help. Maybe I did. But the only help that ever made sense to me was distance." He looked at Marcus with a kind of serene defiance. "I came here because I wanted to stop hurting the world and stop letting it hurt me. The first year was hard, the second was harder. But by the third, I could finally sleep again." Marcus stood in silence, the words sinking deep. He thought of his own sleepless nights, of the ache of failure and loss, of the noise that never stopped even in the quietest towns. He understood, in a way he hadn't expected, what the old man meant. Leroy continued, his tone softening. "I used to come from a family of builders. My father taught me how to work with wood before I ever held a rifle. When I got here, it was like learning to breathe again. Every wall, every shelf, every step you see, built from what the forest gave me. I never took more than I needed. That's the trick. Take only what you can thank." He walked to a shelf and picked up a small sculpture, a fox curled in sleep, carved with delicate precision. "The forest gives you time, Marcus. That's the one thing the world never does." For the next hour, they talked quietly. Leroy told stories of storms survived, of deer that came to drink by the entrance, of nights spent listening to the heartbeat of rain against the bark. Marcus asked questions, some practical, some foolish, and the old man answered each with patient honesty. He spoke not like someone justifying a life of solitude, but like a man describing a long friendship. Eventually, they climbed back up the stairs. The air above felt warmer, the lamplight softer. Marcus sank into the chair by the stove again, still absorbing what he had seen. "You never thought about going back?" he asked. "To people, I mean." Leroy shook his head. "I tried once. Went to town maybe 10, 12 years ago. Thought I'd buy supplies and sit in a diner like I used to. But I couldn't stand it. The noise, the lights, the rush, everyone talking but no one listening. I realized then I wasn't part of that world anymore. And that was all right." He sat opposite Marcus and poured more tea. His hands, though scarred and weathered, were steady. "Most folks spend their whole lives trying to be noticed. I spent mine learning how to disappear." Marcus looked into the steaming mug, unsure what to say. There was something profoundly sad in those words, but also something pure. The man had found peace in the one place no one else had bothered to look. A gust of wind rattled the door, reminding Marcus of the world waiting beyond the bark. If the wrong people found this, he said quietly, they'd shut it down. Say it's illegal, unsafe. Leroy nodded. That's why I keep it secret. Not because I'm hiding something bad, but because some things lose their meaning when they're explained. They sat in silence for a long time. Marcus could feel the forest breathing around them, the steady heartbeat of rain, the deep hum of life that pulsed through the roots of the redwood. He realized then that Leroy hadn't just built a home. He had built a sanctuary, not only for himself, but for the spirit of the forest itself. Eventually, the old man rose and walked to the wall. He pressed a hidden switch, and the lamp's glow dimmed to a faint shimmer. "You can stay tonight if you like," he said. "The storm will pass by morning." Marcus hesitated. His duty told him to return, to report what he had found. But another voice, quieter, older, told him to stay. He nodded slowly. "Thank you." Leroy gestured toward a small cot near the far corner. "You'll be warm there. Don't worry, the tree will keep watch." Marcus lay down, feeling the weight of exhaustion finally settle into his bones. He watched the lamplight flicker across the curved ceiling, the faint pulse of shadows moving like breath. Outside, the rain had softened to a whisper, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, low and mournful. Before sleep claimed him, Marcus thought he heard the old man humming softly to himself, a tune half forgotten, maybe something from his days before the forest. It was not a song of loneliness, but of belonging, of a man who had finally found peace in the silence the world had long since forgotten how to keep. He closed his eyes and let the sound carry him into dreams. The last thing he felt was the warmth of the tree's heart beneath him, steady and alive, as if the forest itself had accepted him for the night. And outside, beyond the bark, the storm died at last, leaving only mist and the faint golden glow from within the ancient redwood, a secret light no one else in the world knew existed. Morning came quietly, without thunder or wind, only a slow, silvery light filtering through the small openings in the redwood's bark. The storm had moved east, leaving the forest still and damp. The scent of wet earth drifted through the cracks, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee. Marcus stirred beneath the woven blanket that Leroy had given him, blinking at the golden glow of the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. For a moment, he did not know where he was. Then he remembered. The light in the forest, the hidden door, the old man who lived inside the tree. Leroy was already awake. He stood by the stove, stirring something in a small pot, the sleeves of his faded shirt rolled to his elbows. His movements were slow but steady, filled with the kind of ease that came from years of routine. He looked up when Marcus sat up, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "You sleep well?" Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. "Like a rock. Hard to believe it was storming like hell just a few hours ago." Leroy smiled faintly, pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs. "The tree doesn't let the noise in. That's why I built it this way. Out there, the world never stops shouting. In here, it remembers how to whisper." Marcus accepted the mug and sipped. The coffee was bitter, but it felt grounding, real. He studied Leroy across the small room, the man's posture, the calm in his eyes. There was something ageless about him, as though he had long since stepped out of time. "How long did it take you to build all this?" Marcus asked, glancing around again. Leroy leaned against the table, considering the question. "Years, decades, maybe. I didn't keep count. You start small, shelter, fire, food, and then one day you look around and realize the forest built a life for you." He ran his calloused fingers across the polished wood of the table. It wasn't about comfort. It was about belonging. Marcus set his mug down. You said you came here after the war. Vietnam, right? Leroy nodded slowly, his eyes distant. 68. Da Nang first, then the Highlands. I was a sapper. Engineer Corps, built bridges, blew them up when told to, fixed what others destroyed what others fixed. After a while, you stop knowing which side you're really on. He fell silent for a long moment, the fire crackling softly between them. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a low murmur. I lost my whole unit in one night. We were building a temporary outpost by a river. Someone, no one knows who, gave the wrong coordinates. Mortars came down before dawn. When I dug myself out, there wasn't anyone left to call to. Marcus didn't speak. He could hear the strain in the old man's voice, the years of silence pressing behind each word. I came home, Leroy continued, but home didn't come back to me. People didn't know what to do with us. Too many uniforms, not enough understanding. My wife, she tried to help. God bless her, she did. But I'd wake up shouting. Couldn't sit in a room if the window was closed. Couldn't stand the sound of fireworks or a car backfiring. The noise never stopped. It followed me everywhere. He looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze with eyes as sharp as the edge of an old blade. So I did the only thing that made sense. I followed the quiet. Marcus nodded slowly. And you ended up here. Not right away. Leroy smiled faintly. I wandered for a few years. Did odd jobs, construction, carpentry, repair work. Always kept moving. Then one day, I crossed into this forest. It was raining then, too. I remember looking up at these giants feeling small for the first time in a long time. Not weak, small. There's a difference. The kind that humbles you, not breaks you. I built a shelter near the river first. When winter came, I nearly froze to death. That's when I found her. The old girl we're sitting in now. She was hollow from lightning years before, but alive, still breathing. I patched her wounds, and she let me stay. The way he spoke about the tree, Marcus realized, was as if it were a person, a living companion. He looked around again, trying to see the place as Leroy saw it, not just as wooden walls, but as something that grew with him. You talk about the forest like it's family, Marcus said quietly. Leroy's smile widened just slightly. It is. Out there, he gestured toward the door, people think they own things. Land, houses, each other. But here, everything owns itself. The deer don't belong to me. The water doesn't belong to me. And I sure as hell don't belong to the government. The forest isn't something you take from. It's something you listen to. He poured more coffee and took a sip, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling. You ever stop to listen, Marcus? Not the kind of listening people do when they're waiting for their turn to speak. I mean, really listen, to the air, to the ground, to your own heartbeat. You start hearing things that aren't words, and after a while you start understanding them. Marcus leaned back in his chair, absorbing the quiet. The forest beyond the bark seemed to pulse with invisible life. Drops of water fell from the high canopy, one by one, like a slow rhythm. Somewhere, far away, a bird called, its cry muffled by mist. I don't think I've ever been that quiet, Marcus admitted. Not for long. Leroy looked at him thoughtfully. Most people aren't. The noise is how they hide from themselves. He stood, his knees cracking softly, and walked to a wooden chest near the wall. From it, he pulled a worn photo album. The pages were brittle, the edges stained with time. He laid it on the table and opened it. The first photograph showed a young man in uniform, standing beside two others in the jungle. Their faces were sunburned, their smiles forced. That's me, Leroy said, pointing to the one in the middle. We thought we were immortal. Turns out we were just kids in borrowed armor." He flipped through the pages. His wedding day. A woman in a white dress holding his hand. A small house in the suburbs. A baby in his arms. Then the pictures stopped. The remaining pages were blank. "She died in 81, he said quietly. "Cancer. I didn't even make it to the hospital in time. By then, I was already out here. I think she knew I wouldn't come back." Marcus felt a weight settle in his chest. He wanted to say something, but nothing seemed right. Leroy closed the album gently and placed his hand on the cover, as if sealing a chapter that no longer hurt but still mattered. After that, there wasn't much reason to go anywhere else. So I stayed, built, fixed, listened. After a while, the forest started answering back. Marcus frowned slightly. "Answering how?" "Not in words," Leroy said, his eyes brightening with quiet amusement. "In signs. A fallen branch across a trail when someone doesn't belong there. A sudden gust of wind when danger's close. Once you've been here long enough, you start to see the pattern. The forest takes care of its own." The thought should have sounded mystical, maybe even delusional, but the way Leroy said it made it feel like a truth that existed beyond logic. Marcus realized that he believed him, not because it made sense, but because the calm in the old man's voice left no room for doubt. "Do you ever get lonely?" Marcus asked. Leroy shook his head. "Not the kind of lonely that hurts. There's a difference between being alone and being forgotten. The forest doesn't forget you. Every morning it reminds me I'm still part of it. Every bird call, every new leaf, every patch of moss that grows where my boots have been." He walked to the wall and touched the wood gently, almost like a prayer. Out there, people spend their lives trying to be remembered. Here, I've learned that being at peace is enough. The day passed slowly. Leroy showed Marcus the upper sections of his home. Small rooms built within the hollow, a collection of tools, and an area where he carved wood into intricate sculptures. The craftsmanship was astonishing. Tiny birds, wolves, owls, each one so lifelike it seemed ready to move. He gave Marcus one, a small figure of a deer mid-stride, carved from the heartwood of the tree itself. "For you," Leroy said simply. "The deer never forgets where it came from." Marcus turned it in his hand, feeling the smooth grain beneath his fingers. "You could sell these. They're beautiful." Leroy chuckled softly. "Sell them? To who? The forest doesn't use money." That night, after supper, they sat by the stove again. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving behind a quiet so deep it felt alive. Marcus found himself talking more than he expected, about his father, his failed marriage, the way he'd lost himself trying to live up to an image of strength. Leroy listened without interruption, his eyes calm and attentive. "When I was a kid," Marcus said, "my dad used to take me camping. He'd tell me that the forest was the only place you could still hear the truth. I never understood what he meant. I thought he was just being poetic." Leroy smiled faintly. He wasn't wrong. The truth's quieter than most folks can stand. The fire crackled. Outside, the moon had risen, spilling pale light through the cracks in the bark. Marcus stared into the embers, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Real, unforced peace. When he finally stood to sleep, Leroy stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "You remind me of myself when I first got here," he said softly. "Restless. Angry at things you can't name. The forest can take that from you if you let it, but you have to listen first." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "I think I want to." "Good," Leroy said. "Then you'll understand why I stay." Marcus lay down once more on the cot, the deer carving still in his hand. As the light dimmed and the fire died, he felt the old man's words echo in the quiet. Somewhere above, the wind moved through the branches of the redwood, a long, slow breath that seemed almost human. He drifted into sleep thinking of Leroy's past, the war, the silence, the loss, and realized that the man had not run from the world out of fear, but out of love. Love for a kind of peace that civilization no longer remembered. And though he didn't yet know it, that night marked the beginning of something deeper. The forest had chosen him too, just as it once chose the old man of the tree. The morning unfolded in silver mist, soft and heavy, wrapping the forest in quiet folds of breath. Marcus woke to the smell of wood smoke and the distant murmur of dripping leaves. The treehouse felt alive around him as though it too was waking slowly after a long dream. The faint creak of the timbers, the sigh of the wind through the cracks, even the muted rhythm of water traveling through hidden roots beneath the floorboards, all of it spoke of life. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and saw Leroy by the table, carving something with a knife so small and sharp that it caught the light in brief, glinting arcs. The old man didn't look up. His concentration was absolute, his hands steady despite their age. The room smelled faintly of pine shavings and oil. Marcus swung his legs off the cot and stretched, feeling the stiffness of a night spent on a wooden mattress, but also a strange peace that lingered from his dreams. "You rise quiet," Leroy said without looking up. "The forest's teaching you already." Marcus smiled faintly. "Or maybe I just didn't want to wake the house." Leroy chuckled, setting down the knife and blowing the dust from his work. It was a small sculpture of a hawk in flight, wings curved and talons extended. "That's good," he said. "Most folks stomp through life so loud they scare their own thoughts away. The trick is learning to move like the trees do. Slow, but never still." Marcus looked around the interior again, trying to take in all the details he'd missed the previous night. The place was extraordinary not just because of where it stood, but because of how alive it felt. Every object had a purpose. Every inch of wood carried marks of care. The furniture wasn't merely built, it was grown into shape, coaxed from the material rather than forced into it. There were carvings of animals on the beams, some polished to a soft sheen, others left raw and textured, as if they'd just emerged from the bark. "You could live here 100 years and never be bored," Marcus said quietly. Leroy nodded. "That's the secret of silence. It isn't empty. It's full of things most people never notice." He poured coffee into 2 metal cups and handed one over. The liquid steamed, carrying a bitter, earthy scent. Marcus sipped it slowly, the warmth spreading through his chest. He felt grounded, present. The usual restlessness that had followed him his whole life, the sense that he was always late to something unseen, was gone. After breakfast, Leroy motioned for him to follow. "You've seen the inside," he said. "Now you should see what the tree watches." They stepped outside, and the air hit them cool and damp. The forest after the storm was a cathedral of light. Shafts of sun filtered through the mist, striking droplets on leaves so they shone like suspended stars. The ground was soft beneath their boots, blanketed with fallen needles. Somewhere high above, water dripped steadily from the canopy, creating a sound like distant applause. Leroy led Marcus along a barely visible trail that wound around the base of the great redwood. "Most folks think silence is the absence of noise," he said as they walked, "but it isn't. Silence is when everything speaks at once, and you finally start hearing it." They moved deeper into the forest, past ferns taller than a man, through shadows thick as smoke. Marcus could feel how the air changed the farther they went. It grew heavier, older, filled with an almost tangible history. Every step carried the weight of centuries. Leroy stopped before a fallen tree, its trunk half buried in moss. "This," he said, "is where I buried my rifle." Marcus blinked. "You mean from the war?" The old man nodded. "First thing I did when I decided to stay. Dug a hole, laid it down, and covered it with soil. I figured if I was ever tempted to use it again, I'd have to fight the earth to get it back. So far, she's winning." He smiled faintly, but his eyes held something deeper, an old grief that had softened with time, but never vanished completely. "I used to hear the sounds of explosions in my sleep. Took years before the forest was louder than the memories. Now, when I wake at night, it's just the rain, the wind, and sometimes the fox that digs near the roots. That's enough." They continued walking until the trees thinned slightly, opening into a small clearing where sunlight spilled across a pool of clear water. The pool was fed by a trickling stream that glided between smooth stones, so pure it reflected the canopy above like a mirror. "This is the heart of it," Leroy said, kneeling by the edge. "The spring runs deep, cold and clean. I built the pipes from here. Brings water straight into the house. The forest provides everything you need if you know how to ask." Marcus knelt beside him, touching the surface of the pool. It was cold enough to sting his fingers. "How did you figure all this out?" Leroy shrugged. "Trial and error, and patience. The woods have their own logic. It doesn't care about time. When you stop rushing, things start to make sense." They stayed there for a while, listening to the slow murmur of the stream. Marcus found himself thinking about his own life. The constant noise of traffic, emails, conversations that never meant anything. Nights when he scrolled through his phone just to fill the silence. Here, none of that existed. The forest didn't care who he was or what he'd done. It simply accepted him, as it did everything else that entered it with respect. When they returned to the redwood, the day had deepened into late afternoon. Golden light slid through the cracks, painting soft shapes across the floor. Leroy went to his workbench and began polishing the hawk carving while Marcus sat nearby, watching the way the man's hands moved with unthinking grace. "I keep journals," Leroy said after a while. "Been writing since the first year I came. Thoughts, changes in the trees, animals I see. Helps me remember the rhythm of things." He reached for a stack of worn notebooks tied together with cord and handed one to Marcus. The pages were filled with tight, neat handwriting. Some entries were dated from decades ago. Marcus flipped through them, reading fragments aloud. "Snow early this year. Found deer tracks near the southern ridge. Heard wolves calling at dawn. A storm broke 3 branches but spared the nest near the top. The tree protects its own. Silence today deeper than usual. Maybe the forest is warning me." Marcus looked up. "Warning you of what?" Leroy smiled faintly. "It's just a feeling. The forest knows before we do when something's wrong." For a moment, they both listened. The forest outside was calm, but there was a subtle tension in the air like a held breath. Marcus shivered slightly, though the air was warm. That night, after supper, the silence grew even heavier. Leroy lit a lantern and the glow cast long shadows across the curved walls. "You know," he said softly, "there was a time I thought this place was just my escape. A hiding hole for a man too tired of people. But after all these years, I realized I didn't choose the forest. It chose me." He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. "When I came here, I thought I'd died somewhere between the noise of the war and the quiet of coming home. The man who left that jungle wasn't me anymore, but the forest didn't ask questions. It just let me breathe. Every tree here remembers something. You can feel it if you stand still long enough. This one, he nodded toward the wall, has been standing for over 2,000 years. Imagine all it's seen. Empires rising and falling, men thinking they owned the earth. And yet, here it stands, unbent. That's what I wanted to be. Marcus felt the weight of those words. And did you become that? Leroy chuckled softly. I learned to bend without breaking. That's enough. They fell into silence again, the kind that didn't need filling. The old man's eyes drifted to the small carvings lining the shelves. Every piece I make, he said after a long pause, is a memory of something I saw and lost. Some are from the war, some from dreams. Others, I think, are from the forest itself. Sometimes I wake up with the shape of something in my head, and by evening it's sitting on the table, like the trees are whispering through my hands. Marcus turned the little deer figurine over in his fingers. He could see now that it wasn't just a sculpture. It carried emotion, movement, and reverence. Do you ever sell them? Trade them? No. The moment you turn them into a transaction, they lose their meaning. These aren't mine to sell. I just borrow them from the wood. Leroy's eyes gleamed in the lamplight, a mixture of weariness and peace. People think living alone breaks you. Maybe it does, for some. But if you let it, solitude remakes you instead. You learn who you are when there's no one left to tell you. Marcus nodded slowly, feeling the truth in that. He thought of his father again, of how the old man had lived by duty, never rest, always chasing responsibility until his heart gave out. For the first time, Marcus wondered if what Leroy had found here was not madness, but freedom. Later, as he lay in his cot, Marcus couldn't sleep. The forest outside was too alive, too present. He listened to the wind moving through the branches, to the soft shifting of wood around him, to the quiet rhythm of Leroy's breathing. The silence was no longer an absence but a living thing, a great, invisible ocean that carried everything within it. He thought of what Leroy had said about listening, truly listening, and realized he had spent his whole life trying to drown out silence instead of understanding it. Out there, in the world he had left behind, quiet was treated like failure. Here, it was truth. Just before he drifted into sleep, he heard Leroy whisper something, a half prayer, half memory. The forest keeps what it loves, the old man said softly, and one day it will keep me too. Marcus lay awake for a long time, staring into the dim glow of the dying lamp. Outside, the ancient trees whispered their slow, endless language, and somewhere in the depths of that sound, he thought he could almost hear the forest breathing, not as something separate, but as part of him. He finally understood what Leroy meant when he said silence wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of sorrow, of peace. And in that fullness, Marcus began to feel something shift inside him. The noise of the world he had carried for years, the regrets, the guilt, the restless hum of disappointment, was fading, replaced by something older and deeper. By the time sleep took him, the forest had claimed him in its quiet way, not as a stranger trespassing through, but as one of its own, another soul learning. Slowly, the language of the trees. The following morning dawned sharp and clear, the kind of morning when the forest looked as though it had been washed clean by the rain. Every leaf glittered with dew, and the light filtering through the canopy was warm and golden, scattered like dust through a cathedral of green. Marcus awoke to the smell of smoke and cedar sap, the sound of crackling firewood somewhere below. Leroy was already up again, moving around the lower level with the same unhurried rhythm that seemed to guide everything he did. The old man had the kind of patience Marcus had always lacked, a calm that seemed to belong not to one man, but to the forest itself. He descended the wooden steps quietly, trying not to disturb the peace. Leroy looked up from his workbench and nodded a greeting. He was cleaning an old kettle, its sides burnished with years of use. "Coffee's almost ready," he said simply. Marcus sat at the table, his hands still cold, and for a long while they said nothing. The quiet between them was companionable now, no longer strange. The silence of the forest had become familiar, something he could wear like a second skin. But there was something different about Leroy that morning, some tension beneath his calm. His shoulders were stiff, his movements deliberate. Marcus noticed the way the old man's eyes flicked toward the window, how his hand paused mid-motion when a branch snapped somewhere outside. The air carried a weight, a warning. "Something wrong?" Marcus asked softly. Leroy didn't answer at first. He set the kettle down and leaned his palms against the table. "You hear that?" he asked. Marcus listened. At first, all he could make out was the usual forest music, the distant call of a jay, the slow drip of water, the sigh of wind high in the canopy. Then he caught it, the faint hum of engines. The sound was alien here, low and mechanical, vibrating through the stillness. "Motors," Marcus said. "Could be rangers checking storm damage." Leroy shook his head. "No, rangers don't ride through this part anymore. Those are ATVs. Too heavy, too loud." He straightened up, and for the first time Marcus saw a flicker of the soldier he must have once been, the measured alertness, the quick calculation in his eyes. "They're poachers. I've seen them before. They come up from the valley when the storms wash away the old barriers. They'll be after redwood burler game, maybe both." Marcus frowned. "You've dealt with them before?" "Too many times," Leroy replied. "They think the forest is a resource, not a home. I usually scare them off before they get too close." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "The forest has a few tricks left in it." Marcus stood. "Then I'll call it in. The Park Service can send a team." "No signal out here," Leroy said flatly. "You'd be shouting into the wind." Marcus's instincts as a ranger kicked in. "We can't just ignore it. They could start fires, destroy the trail system." Leroy's hand came up quiet but firm. "I didn't say ignore it. I said let the forest handle it. But if they come this way, we'll do what we have to." There was something in the old man's tone that left no room for argument. He moved with purpose now, checking the door, dimming the lamps, pulling a tarp across the window slit. The air grew darker inside, tense with expectation. Marcus followed him outside, where the light struck his eyes like a blade. The sound of the engines was clearer now. 3, maybe 4 machines, tearing through the underbrush. The growl echoed across the valley, unnatural in this place of whispers. Leroy crouched beside a tree trunk, eyes scanning the slope below. "They'll come from the ridge," he murmured. "That's where the redwoods are thickest and easiest to cut. They always do." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The sight of another human presence here, destructive, thoughtless, felt almost obscene. The forest had become sacred to him in such a short time that the idea of someone tearing it apart filled him with anger. He turned to Leroy, who was already moving with surprising agility for his age. The old man gestured for him to follow. They descended along a narrow path that wound through ferns and fallen trunks, the air growing cooler as they went. When they reached a low ridge overlooking the stream, Marcus saw them. 3 men on ATVs, wearing camouflage jackets, laughing loudly over the engine's roar. One of them carried a chainsaw strapped to his back. Another had a rifle slung carelessly over his shoulder. They looked out of place here, crude and loud against the solemn majesty of the redwoods. Leroy crouched low, his face unreadable. They'll try to mark a tree first, maybe test how deep the bark is before they cut. We won't let them get that far. Marcus hesitated. What are you planning to do? Nothing that'll hurt them, Leroy said, just enough to make them think the forest's haunted. He moved silently along the edge of the clearing, vanishing behind the moss-draped trunks with a grace that startled Marcus. It was as though the woods themselves hid him. Marcus waited, unsure whether to follow, then noticed a faint rustling sound, something shifting high above. A moment later, one of the poachers killed his engine. "Hey, you hear that?" he called to the others. "What?" "That creaking, like something moving up there." Before the others could answer, a massive branch, loosened by Leroy's careful work with a hidden rope, dropped from above and struck the ground a few feet from their machines. The crash echoed like thunder. Birds exploded from the trees in a frenzy of wings. The men leapt back, cursing. What the hell was that? Wind, maybe? Another sound interrupted them, this one stranger. The hollow moan of air rushing through a slit in the trees, shaped into a haunting, almost human cry. Marcus recognized the pattern. Leroy had drilled holes through fallen logs to create that effect. He'd seen it earlier, mistaken it for natural decay. Now it sounded like the forest itself was wailing. The poachers exchanged nervous looks. "Let's get out of here, man," one muttered. "Relax," another said, forcing a laugh. "It's just wind and dead wood." But even as he spoke, the underbrush rustled and a shape moved behind the trees. Leroy's doing again, Marcus realized. He had hung scraps of bark and cloth that swung eerily in the breeze, making it seem like shadows were shifting of their own accord. The men panicked. One started his engine, the roar echoing off the valley walls, but the ground beneath his tires was slick from the night's rain. The machine skidded, wheels spinning uselessly. The others scrambled to help, shouting over each other, their voices sharp and frantic. Then, above them, a voice rang out, deep, commanding, unmistakably human. "Leave the forest," Leroy called, his tone carrying an authority that froze Marcus where he stood. "It doesn't belong to you." The poachers froze, spinning around, searching for the source. Leroy stepped into view then, not hiding any more, his posture tall and unwavering. The morning light struck his face, and for a moment he looked almost mythic, a figure out of some old legend, the guardian of the woods standing against trespassers. The men stared, caught between fear and confusion. "Old man, you'd better step back," one of them warned, lifting his rifle. "You don't want trouble." Leroy didn't move. "The trouble's already here," he said evenly, "and it's you." Marcus felt his breath catch. He wanted to step forward, to de-escalate, but something held him still. The poachers muttered among themselves, unsettled. Finally, one of them swung a leg over his ATV. "Screw this, let's go. This place gives me the creeps." They left as quickly as they had come, engine sputtering through the underbrush until the sound faded into the distance. Only when the silence returned did Marcus move. He hurried down the slope to where Leroy stood. The old man's breathing was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. "You could have been shot," Marcus said. "You know that?" Leroy nodded, still watching the empty path where the poachers had gone. "Maybe." but sometimes a man's got to show the forest it still has protectors." Marcus stared at him, torn between admiration and frustration. "You scared them off, sure, but what if they come back? What if they tell others?" "They won't," Leroy said simply. "Men like that don't come back to places that make them feel small." They walked back in silence. The forest seemed to exhale around them as if relieved. When they reached the treehouse, Marcus sank into a chair and rubbed his face. His pulse was still racing. Leroy poured 2 cups of water and handed him one. "You did good," he said. "I didn't do anything." "You didn't stop me either," the old man replied with a hint of a smile. "That counts for something." Marcus laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. "You're insane. You know that?" "Probably," Leroy said, "but the forest doesn't mind a little madness." The rest of the day passed slowly. They repaired some damage near the trail, checked the spring, and by afternoon the tension had faded. Yet, Marcus couldn't shake the image of Leroy standing alone before armed men, fearless and steady. He realized then that the old man's solitude wasn't weakness, it was armor. Years of silence had forged him into something unbreakable. That night, as they sat by the fire, Marcus finally spoke what had been circling in his mind. "You said the forest chose you," he began. "Do you think it chooses who protects it too?" Leroy gazed into the flames. "Maybe. Or maybe it just finds those who've got nothing left to lose." Marcus looked down at the deer carving still in his pocket. "And what about me?" The old man's eyes softened. "You'll know when it's your turn to choose." The words lingered long after they went to sleep. Marcus lay awake listening to the wind through the branches, the creak of the tree's heartwood, the faint pulse of water deep below. He thought about his life before this place, the noise, the aimless motion, the feeling of always being on the wrong side of peace. For the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. He felt part of something vast and ancient, something worth protecting. Outside, the forest settled into its nightly rhythm, unbroken now by the growl of engines or the violence of men. The trial had come and gone, and the forest had been defended not by force but by faith. Faith in silence, in presence, in the bond between one man and the land that had become his soul. Marcus closed his eyes, the echoes of the day fading into the slow, eternal breath of the redwoods. Somewhere nearby, Leroy's steady breathing blended with the heartbeat of the forest itself, and for a fleeting moment, Marcus felt as though the two had become one. By the next morning, the forest seemed to have swallowed the memory of the night before. The air was crisp and clean, and the sunlight fell through the canopy in delicate threads, painting the moss-covered ground with shifting gold. The great redwood that sheltered Leroy and Marcus stood motionless, its enormous trunk gleaming faintly with dew. It was difficult to believe that just a day ago the forest had echoed with the sound of engines, shouts, and the grinding of tires against wet soil. Now everything was serene again, as if the woods had chosen to forget the intrusion. Marcus woke late, his muscles still tight from tension and adrenaline. The cot creaked as he sat up. The room smelled faintly of ash and coffee. Leroy sat at the table, whittling a piece of wood into shape. His expression was unreadable. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it never was between them, but it was heavier than usual, filled with thoughts neither man was ready to say aloud. Finally, Marcus broke it. "They won't be back, will they?" Leroy didn't look up. "No, the forest's done with them. They got their warning." He brushed the shavings off his lap and studied his carving, turning it toward the light. It was another animal, a bear this time, its stance protective, its eyes gentle. But that doesn't mean the world outside will leave us alone forever. Marcus frowned. You think more will come? Not them, Leroy said. Others. The world has a way of reaching into places it doesn't belong. I've seen it too many times. They'll keep pushing until nothing wild is left. Marcus leaned back, his gaze drifting to the ceiling where shafts of light flickered between the wooden seams. So what do we do when that happens? Leroy smiled faintly. You already know the answer to that. We do what we've always done. We listen, and we stay quiet. But Marcus couldn't ignore the unease settling in his chest. The confrontation with the poachers had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He had seen the way Leroy stood between them and the trees, fearless and unbending, as if he were made of the same wood that surrounded him. It was noble, but reckless, and Marcus knew what would happen if anyone else, officials, park management, or federal agents, found out about this hidden life inside a protected redwood. They would see only the violation, not the purpose. They would evict him, destroy his home, perhaps even dismantle the tree itself for safety reasons. As he drank his coffee, Marcus realized he was already thinking like a ranger again. Duty pressed against conscience. By law, he should report everything. The illegal structure, the tampering with natural property, the unregistered inhabitant. His job required it. But his heart, bound now to this quiet place, refused. Leroy must have sensed the turmoil in him. He set the carving aside and looked directly at Marcus. You're thinking about what happens next. Marcus didn't deny it. You know I have to file a report. Every time I'm in the field, they ask for one. The old man nodded. And what will you tell them? Marcus hesitated. That the section's clean, that the storm didn't do much damage. That's one kind of truth, Leroy said softly, but not the only kind. Marcus rubbed a hand across his face. If I don't mention you, I'm falsifying a report. It could cost me my job. Leroy's expression didn't change. Then tell them what you need to. But remember this. Some truths belong to the world, and some belong to the forest. You decide which kind of man you are by which ones you keep. His words hung in the air, steady and calm, but they struck deep. Marcus looked at the man sitting before him, the deep lines etched into his face, the quiet strength that seemed to hold the room together, and knew that Leroy wasn't asking for pity or protection. He was asking for understanding. That afternoon, Marcus packed his gear in silence. The time had come for him to return to the ranger station. He had stayed longer than his route allowed. Leroy helped him secure the straps on his pack, but said little else. When the moment finally came to leave, Marcus hesitated at the threshold of the door. The great redwood's interior glowed faintly in the filtered light, as though the tree itself were reluctant to let him go. "Will you be all right?" Marcus asked quietly. Leroy smiled, his eyes kind. "I've been all right for 30 years, son. Don't start worrying about me now." Marcus opened his mouth to say something more, but stopped. There were no words that could do justice to what he felt, the gratitude, the awe, the quiet sorrow. He stepped out into the afternoon sun, the forest's damp scent filling his lungs. Leroy followed him only as far as the clearing, then stopped. "Take this," the old man said, pressing something into Marcus's hand. It was a small wooden medallion, carved with the shape of a tree at its center. "For when you forget what silence sounds like." Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Then he turned and began the long walk back through the woods. The journey out felt different from when he'd first arrived. The forest no longer seemed wild and endless, but familiar, as if each path recognized him. The sunlight flickered between branches like signals, and the wind that rustled the leaves carried whispers he thought he could almost understand. He knew he would never walk these woods the same way again. By the time he reached the ranger station, the sun had dipped low, turning the sky amber. His truck was parked where he'd left it, covered with a thin film of dust and leaves. He sat behind the wheel for a long time before turning the key. When he finally did, the sound of the engine startled him. It felt too loud, too crude after days of listening only to the living hush of the forest. Inside the small office, the world resumed its pace. Phones rang, radios crackled, someone laughed down the hall. The smell of disinfectant and stale coffee replaced the rich scent of pine. It all felt hollow. Marcus sat at his desk, the blank incident report glowing on the computer screen. The cursor blinked patiently, waiting. He stared at it for a long time, the silence in his head growing louder than any noise around him. He typed a few words, then deleted them. Tried again, deleted them again. His fingers hovered over the keys, frozen between two choices: the truth he owed his job and the truth he owed the forest. He saw Leroy in his mind's eye. The way the old man stood before armed poachers, unafraid, the way he spoke of the forest as something sacred, look in his eyes when he said, "You decide which kind of man you are." Marcus's chest tightened. He knew what he had to do. Slowly, he began to type. Sector 14B inspected following storm event. No significant damage observed. Wildlife activity normal. No unauthorized camps or human presence detected. He read the words once, then twice. They were plain, unremarkable, the kind of report no one would ever question. He saved the file and sent it to his supervisor. The decision was made. When he leaned back in his chair, he felt both lighter and heavier at once. He had crossed an invisible line between duty and faith, and though he couldn't yet see where it would lead, he knew it was the right choice. Some secrets weren't meant for the world to hold. That night, Marcus stayed late at the station. The others had gone home, leaving only the hum of the generator and the occasional buzz of a fluorescent light. He opened the drawer of his desk and took out the wooden medallion Leroy had given him. Turning it in his fingers, he saw how the grain of the wood seemed to flow outward from the carved tree, like ripples in water. It was simple, but it felt alive. He placed it around his neck and sat there in the dim light, thinking of the redwood standing silent in the dark forest and of the man who called it home. Days turned into weeks. The park returned to its usual rhythm. Tourists on marked trails, maintenance crews checking boundaries, paperwork stacking in tidy piles. But something in Marcus had changed. He found himself pausing more often on his patrols, standing still in the quiet, listening for sounds that most people ignored. The buzz of an insect, the faint hum of wind through pine needles, the deep, almost imperceptible groan of the earth itself shifting beneath his feet. Each time he stopped, he felt closer to that hidden place, to the truth he was keeping. It wasn't guilt he felt, it was reverence. The secret he carried was no burden, it was a promise. One afternoon, his supervisor, a woman named Keller, called him into her office. "I've been reading your recent reports," she said, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "Everything seems unusually quiet out there. No fallen trees, no vandalism, no issues at all. That section used to be a mess every storm season. What changed?" Marcus kept his expression neutral. "Guess the forest's healing itself." Keller studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "If that's true, it's about time. Keep me posted." When he left her office, his pulse was still racing. He knew how fragile secrets were, how easily one careless word could undo everything. But as he stepped outside, the wind rose, rustling through the tall grass near the station. For a moment, it sounded like laughter, the kind of quiet, knowing laughter that came from somewhere older than the world of men. Marcus smiled. He understood then that the forest would protect its own stories, just as he would protect this one. That night, when he finally lay down to sleep, he dreamed of the redwood again. In his dream, the tree was taller than the sky, and beneath its roots, light moved like water. Leroy was there, his hands resting on the bark, his eyes calm and steady. "You did right," he said softly. "The forest remembers." When Marcus woke, dawn was breaking beyond his window. The world outside looked ordinary, but he knew better. Somewhere, miles away, the old man still lived within his wooden sanctuary, tending his carvings, listening to the silence. And if anyone ever asked Marcus Pierce what he had found deep in the wild heart of the park, he would tell them the truth, just not the whole of it, because some truths were meant to be spoken, and others, like the one rooted in the heart of a living tree, were meant to be kept forever, safe in silence. Years passed quietly, as years tend to do when one stops counting them. The forest remained, endless and patient, its rhythm unbroken by the brief comings and goings of men. Marcus Pierce had become older, though it was hard for him to tell when it happened. The seasons turned with the steady grace of something ancient, and, in their cycle, he had found both solace and purpose. The ranger's uniform no longer felt like a cage, but like a duty he could live with, one that bound him not to bureaucracy, but to the land itself. He had kept his word to the forest and to Leroy Hutchins. Every so often, he returned to the section of the park no one visited anymore. It wasn't on the official maps, and new recruits were told it was off-limits due to unstable terrain. In truth, the ground was solid as stone. The instability lay in the hearts of those who might come searching for what should remain hidden. Marcus walked the same trails he had once followed as a lost man in a storm, tracing paths now overgrown with ferns and ivy. The air there felt different, denser somehow, as if time itself slowed out of respect for the silence that dwelled within. Each visit, he approached the old redwood expecting change. He expected to see rot creeping through its bark, or the soil eroded from its roots, but it always stood as it had before. Immense, immovable, its trunk glowing faintly under the filtered sunlight. It looked like something that had been standing since the first dawn and would remain long after the last dusk. For a long time after he left the ranger's service, Marcus told himself he would go one last time, to say goodbye properly. But there was always an excuse: weather, work, the fear of finding the place gone, or worse, finding it exactly the same. It was not until the winter of his 54th year, when the first snow dusted the tops of the ridges, that the call of that quiet place became too strong to ignore. He packed light, just enough food for a few days, a canteen, and a small carving knife he had carried for years but seldom used. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. Some journeys were meant to be walked alone. The drive took him longer than it once would have. The roads were rougher now, the asphalt fractured by roots reclaiming what once had been taken. When he parked near the old ranger gate, the air smelled sharp and cold, full of pine and distant rain. He began to walk. The trail greeted him like an old friend. Familiar bends, the whisper of wind through branches, the creak of old trunks shifting against one another. The forest had changed little in 20 years. Even the fallen logs seemed to rest in the same places, as if time itself had learned not to disturb the keeper's domain. Marcus's breath came slow and visible in the chill air. With every step, he felt the pull of memory, each tree a page in the story he had chosen to keep hidden. He reached the clearing by afternoon. The great redwood towered above him exactly as he remembered. Moss draped its lower trunk like an ancient robe, and its bark was warm where the sun touched it. Marcus stood at its base for a long while, his hand pressed to the living wood, half expecting to feel the faint vibration of machinery beneath his palm, the hum he had once mistaken for something man-made. But there was only the steady pulse of life, deep and slow. He called out softly, though he knew the answer before the sound left his lips. "Leroy?" No reply, only the rustle of leaves, the creaking of branches in the wind. Marcus found the hidden seam easily. The bark had grown slightly over it, but the outline of the door remained. He pressed his shoulder against it, and with a reluctant groan, it opened. The smell that met him was not decay, as he feared, but wood smoke and cedar oil, faint but unmistakable. Inside, dust hung in the golden shafts of light spilling from the cracks above. Everything was as it had been. The carved table, the small bed against the wall, the tools neatly arranged on the shelf. Time had touched the place gently, as if it too had learned reverence. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The silence wrapped around him like a memory. A thin layer of dust coated the surfaces, but nothing had been disturbed. The stove was cold, the ashes long settled. Marcus walked to the workbench and found the last carving Leroy must have been working on, a small wooden owl, its wings half finished. The knife lay beside it, rusted now, but still sharp enough to catch the light. "Guess you never finished this one," Marcus murmured. His voice felt too loud in the hush. He turned slowly, taking in the space that had once felt impossibly alive. For a moment, he thought he could almost see the old man sitting there again, smiling faintly, his eyes calm and knowing. It struck Marcus then that Leroy had probably died as he lived, quietly, without complaint, without needing anyone to bear witness. There was no grave, no marker. Only the room, preserved like a memory the forest had decided to keep. Marcus knelt by the stove and ran his fingers over the stone floor, half expecting to find something, an inscription, a note, some trace of farewell. And then he saw it, carved into the wood of the table, faint and rough but unmistakable. "If you're reading this, the forest chose you next." Marcus sat back, his heart tightening. Beneath the words was a small drawing of the redwood, its roots spreading wide, and beneath them the outline of two figures, one old, one young, standing side by side. He didn't cry at first. He simply sat there, staring at the carving until his vision blurred. Only when he reached out and touched the letters did the tears come, slow and soundless. He stayed like that for a long time, listening to the forest breathe through the cracks in the walls. By evening, he had gathered enough wood to start a small fire in the stove. The flames filled the hollow with warmth, flickering over the carvings that lined the shelves. In their light, the animals seemed almost alive, watching him. He spoke softly to them as if to Leroy himself. He told them about the years that had passed, about the new rangers, about how the park had grown more protected, less wild in some places, but still untouched in others. He told him about the tourists who came with cameras and drones, and how he had always steered them away from this part of the forest. When he fell silent, the fire crackled, answering in its own way. That night, Marcus lay in the cot beneath the curved ceiling of the redwood's heart. The air was thick with warmth and memory. As he drifted toward sleep, he thought he heard movement outside, a soft step, a faint whisper. He opened his eyes, expecting to find the door ajar, but it was closed tight. The sound came again, closer this time, like the brush of a hand against bark. Then he heard it clearly, the deep, slow creak of the great tree shifting, as though it were breathing with him. In that moment, he felt it, the presence that Leroy had spoken of all those years ago. The forest was alive, aware, ancient beyond measure. It had watched him arrive as a young man, full of confusion, and now it welcomed him back as one of its own. He felt no fear, only a profound peace, the kind that comes when a man finally understands his place in the order of things. In the morning, he found the letter. It was folded neatly beneath the half-finished owl, sealed with a bit of wax so brittle it crumbled at his touch. The paper had yellowed with age, the handwriting rough but clear. If you ever come back, you'll know what to do. Don't let them find this place. Some things aren't meant to be seen by those who count the world in acres and dollars. When I go, I'll be a part of the tree. Maybe you'll hear me in the wood, maybe not. Either way, don't mourn. Just listen. The forest keeps its own. The signature was faint but legible. Leroy Hutchins. Marcus read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket. He spent the rest of the day tending to the place, sweeping the floor, clearing dust from the shelves, fixing the small window shutter that had loosened with time. It felt less like cleaning and more like ritual, like preparing a shrine. When he was done, he stood in the doorway, looking out at the sea of green. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, quiet and eternal. He knew he would have to leave soon. He was no hermit, no keeper in the way Leroy had been. But as he stood there, he realized something that made him smile through his sadness. The secret wasn't about the treehouse itself. It was about the silence, the reverence it taught. That was what needed protecting. That was what he would carry with him. Before he left, Marcus took the unfinished owl from the table. He finished carving its wings with Leroy's old knife, each stroke slow and deliberate. When it was done, he set it beside the bear, the hawk, and the deer. Then he took the medallion from around his neck and hung it on the hook above the stove. It gleamed faintly in the dim light, a symbol of both promise and closure. He whispered a final goodbye, though he knew the forest had already heard it, and stepped out into the fading light. The door closed behind him with a soft sound, almost like a sigh. By the time he reached the ridge, the sun was setting, and the forest glowed with that strange, holy light that comes only in late afternoon. Neither day nor night, but something between. Marcus stopped once to look back. Through the trees, he thought he saw a flicker of light from the base of the redwood, as though a lantern still burned within. For a moment, he imagined Leroy there, sitting by the stove, smiling as he always had. Then the light faded, swallowed by the coming dusk. He never spoke of that journey to anyone. Years later, when younger rangers asked him why the northern section of the park was still closed, he would only smile and say, "Some places just aren't meant to be managed." They would laugh, thinking it a joke, and he would let them. The truth belonged where it had always belonged, in the hush between wind and roots, in the quiet memory of a man who had once kept watch over the living heart of the forest. When Marcus Pierce finally grew old, long after the strength had gone from his hands, people often saw him walking the park trails alone, stopping now and then to rest his palm against the trunk of a tree. He never lost the habit of listening. On the day he died, sitting on a bench overlooking the valley, a soft wind swept through the trees. The sound it made was low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat, like breathing. And somewhere, deep in the forest, where no one but the birds and the shadows ventured, the redwood still stood, its roots buried deep in the earth, its hollow glowing faintly in the twilight. Inside, the carvings watched in silence, and the medallion above the stove swung gently in the wind that found its way through the cracks. No one ever found a place, but sometimes hikers passing far to the south would say they felt watched, not in fear, but with the strange tender awareness of something vast and kind keeping vigil. They would stop, listen, and for a moment hear the quietest whisper beneath the sign of the branches. The forest keeps what it loves. And so it did. There are more stories waiting just beyond this one. So make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications. Watch the next video for another twist you'll never forget. And share this one with your friends to keep the mystery alive.